Late on Saturday night, July 19th, 1952, the radar room at Washington National Airport settled into the strange quiet that only exists after most of a city has gone to bed. The runways were still alive. Commercial flights still moved in and out of the capital. Controllers still watched their scopes, listened to radio traffic, and kept the normal traffic of the night from drifting into danger. But at about 11:40, an air traffic controller named Edward Nugent saw something that did not belong there. On his radar screen, 7 targets appeared roughly 15 miles south-southwest of Washington, D.C. They were not following a standard airway. They did not match scheduled aircraft. They were not behaving like slow private planes or military traffic coming in under normal control. They were simply there, bright enough on the scope to be noticed, moving in a way that made the operator stop and call for another set of eyes. Nugent called his supervisor, Harry Barnes. Barnes came over, looked at the radar, and saw the same thing. The blips were moving through the capital's airspace in a pattern he did not like. Some seemed to drift. Some seemed to accelerate. Some appeared to move with a speed or direction that did not fit the aircraft he was used to handling every night. For an air traffic controller, a strange light in the sky is not automatically a crisis. A strange return on radar is different. Radar is the instrument that is supposed to cut through human error. It is supposed to show what the eye cannot. When the screen itself starts showing the impossible, the room changes. Phones began moving the report outward. Controllers checked with other positions. They looked for flight plans. They compared the unknown targets with known aircraft. They called Andrews Air Force Base. They tried to determine whether these were planes, weather, equipment trouble, or something else moving across one of the most sensitive pieces of sky in America. Outside the radar room, Washington was wrapped in summer heat. The White House, the Capitol, the Pentagon, and the military commands of the Cold War sat under the same dark, humid air. The country was already nervous. The Korean War was still being fought. Atomic fear had become part of ordinary political life. The Soviet Union was not an abstraction. It was the shadow on every national security conversation. So when unknown targets appeared on radar near the Capitol, the question was not just, what are they? The question was, what if they are hostile?
Welcome to Unexplained History. I'm Tom Mackenzie. What makes this case so different from the usual UFO story is the setting. This is not a lone witness on a rural road. This is Washington National Airport. It is trained controllers, military bases, commercial pilots, and fighter aircraft, all caught inside one of the strangest nights in Cold War aviation history.
Barnes later described the movements as completely radical compared with ordinary aircraft. That does not mean he was right about what the targets were. It does mean that, in the moment, the people whose job was to understand the air over Washington believed they were seeing something they could not identify. And then the reports stopped being just marks on a scope. Pilots began seeing lights. The first night of the Washington flap grew by telephone, radio call, and rumor moving through official channels. National Airport had the radar contacts. Andrews Air Force Base had its own personnel looking into the sky. Tower operators tried to match what radar said with what human eyes could see. Every new report seemed to pull the case farther away from a simple equipment glitch. At one point, a Capital Airlines pilot named S.C. Pierman became part of the story. According to accounts preserved in the case history, Pierman reported seeing several bright, fast-moving white lights. He was in contact with the controllers, and Harry Barnes later said some of the lights the pilot described appeared to correspond with returns on the radar screen. That is the moment the case becomes dangerous for skeptics and irresistible for believers. A radar ghost can be blamed on the machine. A light in the sky can be blamed on a star, a meteor, or a tired observer. But when a pilot says he sees something while a controller says a radar target is in the same general area, the mind wants to connect the two. It wants the machine and the witness to confirm each other. At Andrews, the reports were more uneven and, in some ways, more revealing. Some witnesses described fiery or orange lights. Some thought they saw objects moving fast or changing direction. Others later seemed to be looking at stars, meteors, or ordinary points of light made strange by suggestion and stress. That mix matters. It keeps the case from being clean. It also makes the night feel more real. Real historical mysteries usually do not arrive as perfect evidence. They arrive as overlapping fragments. A controller's certainty, a pilot's excitement, a tower operator's confusion, a bright object that may have been a meteor, a radar return that may have been weather, and a phone line connecting people who are all trying to decide whether the Capitol is under observation. The airmen at Andrews did not all report the same thing. Some accounts are dramatic. Others are cautious. In later analysis, a few of the visual sightings were judged likely to be stars or meteors. But at the time, the important thing was not whether every report was strong. The important thing was that the reports kept coming while the radar room was already watching the unknowns. In the middle of that night, ordinary explanations did not feel ordinary. If someone saw a bright light after being told that radar had an unknown target in that direction, the light became part of the pattern. If a target appeared to move near a sensitive area, the return became more than a blip. If an object vanished from the scope, the disappearance could feel intelligent. Washington was not just seeing lights. Washington was building a story in real time. And every person inside that story had a job that depended on knowing the difference between a harmless oddity and a threat.
This is one of the traps in the Washington case. You can feel why people believed it. The witnesses are not random. The location is serious. The timing is terrifying. But the evidence is messy from the beginning, and that mess is exactly where the legend starts to grow.
By the early morning hours of July 20th, the mystery had moved from a radar room problem into a military problem. Unknown targets had been reported near the Capitol. Civilian controllers were not satisfied. Andrews had been pulled in. Pilots had spoken up. The next step was obvious. Send fighters. The jets that answered Washington's call were F-94 interceptors, all-weather fighters designed for a world that expected enemy bombers to come through the dark. They were not symbols. They were weapons with radar in the nose, crews trained for interception, and a Cold War purpose that gave every scramble a hard edge. The first fighters came from Newcastle Air Force Base in Delaware. But by the time they reached the Washington area, the radar targets that had started the alarm were gone. That detail became one of the most famous parts of the story. In the believer's version, the unknown object saw the jets coming and disappeared before they could be intercepted. When the jets left, the targets returned. To anyone already inclined to imagine controlled craft, that pattern looks like intelligence. It looks like something probing the Capitol and avoiding contact. It looks like a game being played over Washington by objects that understood exactly how to stay out of reach. There is another way to read it. Intermittent radar anomalies can appear and vanish. Weather-related returns can strengthen, fade, and reappear without any intention behind them. Radar operators can also interpret a changing pattern through the pressure of the moment, especially when fighters are being scrambled and everyone is waiting for a decisive answer. But inside the room, in the early morning, that calmer explanation had no dramatic power. What people knew was simpler. There had been targets, fighters came, the targets were no longer there, and the night did not feel settled. The strange part of this case is that the lack of interception did not weaken the legend. It strengthened it. If the pilots had arrived and seen nothing because there was nothing there, the case might have faded. Instead, the timing created a story that felt almost too perfect. The unknowns appeared, the military reacted, and the unknowns slipped away. For the Air Force, that was a problem. The service was already dealing with a wave of UFO reports across the country. Project Blue Book, the official Air Force investigation, was under pressure to explain sightings that kept appearing in newspapers. Its director, Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, later called that summer part of the great UFO flap of 1952. Ruppelt was not a cartoon debunker. He was not casually dismissive of every report. He had seen enough strange files to understand why witnesses could be sincere, and he had also seen enough confused reports to know how easily ordinary things became extraordinary once they entered the UFO machinery. That is what made Washington so difficult. If this had been another rural light, it could sit in a file. If this had been one mistaken pilot, it could be handled quietly. But radar targets over the Capitol, commercial pilots reporting lights, and fighter scrambles from an Air Force base created a different kind of pressure. The press noticed immediately. Newspapers did not need to invent much. The phrase practically wrote itself. Saucers over Washington. The image was too powerful to resist. Flying discs had been in the American imagination since 1947, but this was not a mountain, a desert, or a highway. This was the seat of government. A saucer over a farmhouse was a curiosity. A saucer over the Capitol was a threat.
And once the headlines framed it that way, the government had two problems. It had to figure out what the radar returns were. But it also had to figure out how to keep the public from deciding that the United States could not control the sky over its own capital.
For a few days, the first weekend hung over Washington as a frightening anomaly. The Air Force could suggest temperature inversions. Skeptics could point out weak visual evidence. Radar specialists could talk about false targets. But the story had already entered the public bloodstream. Then, 1 week later, it happened again. The week between the two Washington incidents is where the episode becomes larger than one night. Across the country, UFO reports were already rising. Air crews were seeing lights. Radar operators were filing strange returns. Newspapers were learning that flying saucers sold papers, and official silence only made the stories feel more important. Ruppelt was in Washington when the July 19th incident hit the press. According to his later account, he learned about it from headlines, not from a smooth official briefing. That detail says a lot about the condition of the UFO investigation at the time. Lubbock was supposed to be the central office, but the system around it was often disorganized, defensive, and slow. The Air Force did not have a single comm machine for handling public UFO panic. It had investigators, intelligence officers, public information people, commanders, and radar specialists, all moving at different speeds. Some wanted answers. Some wanted the story contained. Some thought the cases were nonsense. Some were worried that they were not. Washington exposed those tensions. If the targets were weather, the Air Force needed to explain why trained controllers had reacted so strongly. If the lights were stars and meteors, officials needed to explain why pilots and tower personnel thought they were related to radar. If the case was unknown, they had to explain what unknown meant when the unknown was over the Capitol. There was no easy public sentence that could hold all of that. And the second weekend made everything worse. On the night of July 26th into July 27th, the radar reports returned. Again, there were unknown targets. Again, controllers and military personnel tried to make sense of them. Again, fighters were vectored toward reported blips. This time, the story had more official attention and more people close to the machinery of explanation. Albert Chopp, the Air Force press spokesman, connected with Project Blue Book, was at Washington National Airport. Major Dewey Fournette, Blue Book's Pentagon liaison, was involved in the unfolding events. Reporters were close enough to feel the drama, rather than only read about it afterward. The second night was no longer a surprise happening in private. It was an event occurring under the eyes of a system already embarrassed by the first one. That matters, because the second weekend shifted the meaning of the flap. One strange night can be treated as a one-off. 2 weekends in a row in the same sensitive airspace, with journalists watching and military officials involved, becomes a national story. The fighter accounts from the second weekend became part of UFO lore. Captain John McHugo was vectored toward targets, but reportedly saw nothing. Lieutenant William Patterson and another interceptor became associated with reports of white glows or lights that seemed impossible to close on. In later retellings, this became one of the most cinematic moments. A fighter pilot surrounded by unknowns, asking what he should do, while the control room has no answer that makes sense. The exact details should be handled carefully. The case has been retold for decades, and some versions are cleaner than the evidence deserves. But the core historical pressure is real enough. Pilots were being sent toward unknown radar targets near Washington. The people coordinating the response could not give the public a satisfying explanation in the moment. Inside the UFO narrative, that looked like proof that something intelligent was toying with America's defenses. Inside the government, it looked like something else as well, a failure of control.
That is the turn I think matters most. Whether the radar returns were craft, weather, or some mixture of reports, Washington forced officials to confront a new kind of vulnerability. A UFO wave could tie up phones, trigger headlines, scramble aircraft, and make the government look helpless without a single bomb falling.
By the end of the second weekend, there was no way for the Air Force to let the story fade quietly. The Capitol had been under a saucer scare twice. Newspapers were watching. The public wanted an answer. Officials had to step forward and say something definitive enough to calm the country. On July 29th, 1952, the Pentagon held one of the largest press conferences since the Second World War. General John A. Samford, the Air Force Director of Intelligence, became the face of the official answer. Sitting before reporters, with General Roger Ramey alongside him, Samford had to do something more delicate than simply deny the reports. He had to acknowledge that many witnesses were credible, while also insisting that the situation did not represent a national security threat. That balance is why the press conference still matters. Samford did not stand up and say everyone was lying. He spoke in the careful language of a military intelligence officer facing a public storm. He allowed that credible observers had reported relatively incredible things. That idea, in one form or another, became one of the most memorable official summaries of the UFO problem. Believable people were seeing unbelievable things, but the explanation moved toward the ordinary. Temperature inversions, misidentified lights, radar effects, natural phenomena, human interpretation. To the public, temperature inversion could sound like a phrase pulled from a file cabinet to make the mystery go away. To a radar specialist, it was not ridiculous at all. A temperature inversion happens when the normal pattern of air changes, with warmer air sitting over cooler air in a way that can bend radio and radar signals. Add humidity layers and the right atmospheric structure, and radar beams can travel in unexpected ways, strike objects or ground features they normally would not, and return false or misleading targets. In plain language, the atmosphere can become a warped lens. That does not mean every return on every scope was fake. It means the equipment could be seen through a distorted layer of air, and the screen could show movement that was not the movement of a physical aircraft. In 1952, radar was powerful but not magical. It did not have modern digital filtering. Operators were skilled, but the technology had limitations, especially in unusual weather. Still, the inversion explanation had a public relations problem. It asked people to believe that a complicated atmospheric effect had fooled experienced controllers, triggered military alerts, and coincided with lights reported by pilots and tower personnel. For many witnesses, that felt insulting. They knew what ordinary clutter looked like. They believed they could tell the difference. That tension is the heart of the Washington case. The official explanation was plausible. The witnesses were not fools. Those two facts can exist together, even if they make the story harder to reduce to a single answer. Samford's press conference calmed some of the immediate pressure, but it did not kill the mystery. If anything, it created a second mystery layered on top of the first. Was the Air Force explaining the incident or managing the story? Was temperature inversion the answer, or the answer the public was supposed to accept? Were the officials being honest, or were they using a real phenomenon to cover something stranger? UFO culture would return to those questions for decades.
This is where I would be careful. It is tempting to say the government lied, because that makes a cleaner story. But the record points to something more interesting. The Air Force may have had a real explanation for much of what happened, and it still may have been trying to shape public belief at the same time.
After the press conference, the Washington flap did not disappear from official concern. It moved into a different part of the government mind. The question was no longer only what people had seen. It was what UFO reports could do to a country already living under Cold War pressure. That is where the case leaves the radar room and enters the machinery of intelligence. By late 1952, the Central Intelligence Agency and other officials were paying close attention to the UFO problem, but not necessarily for the reason later mythology suggests. The public imagination wants the CIA to appear, because aliens are real and secret vaults are being opened behind locked doors. The documents point toward a colder, more bureaucratic fear. Officials worried that UFO reports could create panic. They worried that enemy forces might exploit the reporting system. They worried that a flood of sightings could clog communication channels, distract air defense personnel, or make it harder to identify a real attack. That concern was not absurd. Imagine the United States in 1952. Air defense radar expanding, nuclear anxiety rising, newspapers amplifying every saucer story, and thousands of citizens learning that if they saw a light in the sky, they could call authorities and become part of a national mystery. Even if every UFO report were mistaken, the wave itself could become a problem. A false alarm can still damage a system. The Washington flap made that visible. 2 weekends of radar confusion and headlines had shown that UFOs were no longer just weird stories. They were capable of producing operational stress. They could scramble jets, fill newspapers, embarrass officials, and make people wonder whether the government was hiding the truth or losing control. In January 1953, the Robertson Panel convened. It was a CIA-sponsored scientific advisory panel that reviewed UFO evidence and the public problems surrounding it. The panel did not announce that saucers were alien craft. Its recommendations went in the opposite direction. UFOs should be stripped of their special status. Public fascination should be reduced. Debunking and education should help drain the subject of mystery. That recommendation is one of the most important facts in the whole story. For believers, it looks like the beginning of an official campaign to suppress the truth. And in a narrow sense, there really was an official interest in reducing public excitement. The government did want to shape perception. It did want to make UFOs less powerful in the American imagination. But the reason does not have to be alien secrecy. The reason can be national security in the bluntest Cold War sense. A frightened public, flooded phone lines, radar rooms chasing ghosts, and newspapers screaming about saucers over the Capitol could be dangerous, even if the sky contained nothing but weather and misread lights. That is the strange, unsatisfying middle ground of the case. The cover-up argument has a real document trail when it means perception management. It becomes much weaker when it claims the same documents prove extraterrestrial craft over Washington. The government learned something in 1952. It learned that UFOs did not have to be real in the physical sense to be real in the political sense. They could move people, aircraft, and headlines while forcing generals to explain the sky. And once a mystery can do that, controlling the mystery becomes part of the job.
That may be the most unnerving version of the Washington story. Not that the government definitely saw alien craft and covered them up, but that the government saw how powerful belief could become and decided belief itself needed to be managed.
The later skeptical analysis gives us a way to understand what may have happened on the radar scopes, but it does not fully erase what happened afterward. The inversion may explain the blips. It does not explain why the blips became a national event, or why the response moved so quickly toward debunking the public imagination. To get there, we have to return to the weather over Washington. Years after the Washington flap, the University of Colorado UFO study, better known through the Condon Report, revisited radar and optical cases with a more technical eye. In the section analyzing the Washington incidents, Gordon Thayer examined the atmospheric conditions and radar behavior from July 19th to 20th and July 25th to 27th. His conclusion was not friendly to the alien interpretation. The weather in the Washington area was conducive to anomalous propagation. That phrase sounds dry, but the image is simple enough. Picture the air above the city layered like glass at slightly different temperatures and humidities. A radar beam that should travel in a predictable path bends through those layers. It reaches farther than expected, catches ground objects or atmospheric structures, and sends returns back to the scope. Those returns can look like targets. They can appear to move. They can seem to accelerate or vanish. In the Condon analysis, the radar tracks from Washington were generally not cleanly correlated across systems, aircraft radar, and visual observations. Ground radar operators might find a return in the general direction of a visual report, but the tight, perfect match that makes a case feel undeniable was often missing. The visual sightings themselves were mixed. Some look like meteors. Some look like stars distorted by atmosphere and expectation. Some remained too vague to identify confidently. That does not make the witnesses dishonest. It makes the night human. A person in a control tower, already aware that radar is reporting unknown targets, looks into a sky full of stars, haze, aircraft lights, and meteors. Another person says a target is in a certain direction. The eye searches that area. A light seems to move. A star seems to flicker red, orange, green. A meteor becomes part of the same event. The mind is not stupid. It is trying to assemble scattered signals into a useful picture. Radar operators were doing the same thing on their screens. The strongest skeptical explanation, then, is not that everyone panicked over nothing. It is that a real atmospheric condition created misleading radar returns, while ordinary visual stimuli were pulled into the pattern by timing, stress, and expectation. The Cold War did the rest, but the strongest mystery does not completely vanish. Harry Barnes and other operators believed they were seeing returns unlike normal clutter. Some witnesses maintained their skepticism of the temperature inversion answer for years. The repetition across 2 weekends still feels eerie. The official response still looks defensive. And the case still sits in that frustrating zone where enough evidence exists to make dismissal feel too easy, but not enough exists to prove the extraordinary claim. That is why the Washington flap lasted. If it had produced wreckage, it would be history. If it had produced nothing but one bad sighting, it would be forgotten. Instead, It produced something more durable. Credible people, ambiguous instruments, national anxiety, and an official explanation that was plausible but emotionally unsatisfying.
The hardest mysteries are often like that. They do not give you the clean evidence you want, but they also do not give you the clean dismissal you want. They leave you with a record that keeps asking to be interpreted.
By the time the technical explanations were written down, the cultural meaning had already escaped. The Washington UFO flap had become proof of something, depending on who was telling it. Proof that saucers were real. Proof that the Air Force covered up the truth. Proof that radar could be fooled. Proof that panic could travel faster than facts. The unsettling part is that more than one of those can be partly true. In the end, the 1952 Washington UFO flap does not need alien spacecraft to be disturbing. It begins with a controller seeing 7 targets where they should not be. It moves through a supervisor who believes the returns are not ordinary aircraft. It gathers pilots, tower operators, Andrews personnel, fighter crews, reporters, Project Blue Book, Air Force generals, and the CIA. It climbs from one radar screen to the front pages, then into a Pentagon press conference, then into a classified world where officials ask how to drain mystery from the public mind. That path is the real shape of the incident. The official answer, temperature inversion and anomalous radar propagation, is not a joke. The later technical analysis gives it weight. The weather over Washington likely helped create false or misleading radar returns. Some of the lights people saw were probably meteors, stars, or ordinary objects made strange by the pressure of the night. The fighter scrambles did not produce decisive proof. No photograph, wreckage, or close inspection settles the case in favor of physical craft. But the witnesses were not imaginary. The alarm was not imaginary. The headlines were not imaginary. The government's concern was not imaginary. For the people in those rooms, the flap was real because they had to act as if it might be real. A controller cannot ignore an unknown target near the Capitol because it might be weather. A pilot cannot dismiss a light if the tower is asking him to look. A general cannot tell the public to relax when newspapers are suggesting saucers have flown over Washington. The historical truth sits in that gap between what probably happened and what people had to do about it. Maybe the sky held no invaders. Maybe the radar was bending through layers of summer air, catching ghosts made by physics rather than machines from somewhere else. Maybe the lights were stars, meteors, aircraft, and the human need to match the eye to the instrument. But the system reacted. Jets launched. Phones rang. Reporters wrote. The Pentagon answered. The CIA studied not only the objects, but the fear around the objects. That is why this case still matters. The Washington flap shows how a mystery can become a national security event without ever becoming a solved physical event. It shows how uncertainty, when placed over the right city at the right historical moment, can become powerful enough to change policy. It shows why the government might want to manage belief, even when it does not possess a hidden alien body or a captured machine. And it leaves one final image. A radar screen in the Capitol. A few bright returns moving where they should not move. Men leaning closer in the dark, trying to decide whether they are watching aircraft, weather, or history. By sunrise, the blips are gone. What remains is the lesson Washington learned from them. A mystery in the sky does not have to be an invasion to make a government afraid.